1853, a significant year for two men. One would arrive in San Francisco with the wave of those seeking fortunes from all over the country and the world. He came from an African-American family, a prominent African-American family. In fact, his father was the second wealthiest black in Philadelphia, who had died about 5 years before. Another man who came from another prominent family in Connecticut, but was the rector of a parish in Albany, New York, was elected by the House of Bishops to become the first missionary bishop of California. He too was very prominent, had graduated from Yale, was a scholar and a published author. He arrives the next year having crossed the isthmus with his family and survived and came into California. Their two lives would eventually meet. The one from Philadelphia, his father had been a barber as well as a banker and a real estate investor, and he had been trained as a barber. So he was a barber in Portsmouth Square, which is now Chinatown in San Francisco. And I just wonder if this other man, the new Bishop of California, didn't at some point have his hair cut by the one who had come from Philadelphia. Now, the whole story of the first bishop, missionary bishop of California, is another story to be told, because when he arrived, the Episcopalians in California didn't want him. And they reluctantly allowed him to take up space in a small chapel of Trinity Church, which was called Grace. And we know the story going forward in terms of that little chapel. But that's a little later story to be talked about. And we're going to talk about this man who somehow arrived in California. We do not know by what means. More than likely, as a black, he did not come across country on a wagon train, because in 1850, Congress had passed the Fugitive Slave Act because of the power of the southern members of Congress, saying that any slave who escaped from their owner, if apprehended any place in the country, could be taken and resold in the South or returned to their owners. So it really didn't matter whether you were free or not. Your chances of being apprehended and sold were pretty high. Things were building up steam in the East and would eventually end up in the Civil War. And so Peter Williams Castee probably came by ship, arriving in 1853. And when he arrives, he discovers that California that had been entered into the Union as a free state had slaves. In fact, most of the surviving native population were enslaved. They had been enslaved by the Spanish under first the Franciscans and then under the Mexicans with the ranchos. And those slaves just passed over as property to the Yankees, who started buying up the land grants. And so actually in 1855, the census says there are 5,000 enslaved persons in California. Now, Peter arrived with a sizable fortune, the inheritance from his father. And he gathered with others, mostly whites, who were abolitionists, and they began to buy enslaved persons and get them out of California, probably to Oregon, which is not necessarily the best place to go, but better than California. And so he is a part of a formation of the first Congress of free Africa, the first Congress of California colored citizens country, and we could form a Congress that meets in San Francisco. In 1857, a court case is brought before the state Supreme Court of a slave by the name of Archie Lee, who had been brought as a 19-year-old that year to California by his owner. Lawyers had contacted him and said, you know, this is a free slave state. You do not have to remain enslaved to your owner. And so his owner took the case to the state Supreme Court. Now, the federal Supreme Court, with the Dred Scott case, that same year, refused to acknowledge Dred Scott as a human being and as a citizen of the country, and therefore declared that all blacks in America had no rights as a citizen. Our Supreme Court declared Archie Lee had a right and that he was a recognized citizen of California. But at that moment, all the blacks that could get out of California got out of California. So in the census of 1860, we have Peter and his wife, and we're not sure exactly how he and Annie were married, but they knew each other in Philadelphia. They are in the census of Oregon in Portland. That year they come down to San Jose because Annie's sister and her husband, who they knew all back in Philadelphia, said, come back to San Jose, it is now safe to be in California. And so they arrived in San Jose in 1860. 1861, Episcopalians finally convinced Bishop Kipp that a parish could be founded in San Jose. He was not interested in doing that because San Jose was the murder capital and the hanging capital of California all during the 50s, 1850s. In fact, it was divided that in 1861 between Confederates and Union sympathizers. So 1861, Trinity Church is founded. We go to the parish registers. There in the parish registers, in terms of founding members, is Peter Williams Cassie. Amazing. A predominantly white church that had to have slave owners in the congregation has a black that is one of the first members of that congregation. The black community in San Jose had a single focus. Regardless of whether they had any status according to the U.S. Constitution or not, the education of their children was paramount. If there is going to be any what they called uplift, it is going to be through education. So Peter and Annie, they come together with the black community and they form St. Philip's Church. Remember, Keith went to become rector of St. Philip's in New York City. It's not by chance that those two institutions carry the same name, because it was his grandfather's memory that Peter is pulling together. And therefore, a primary school is established that begins to become a boarding school, because blacks all over California and the West, and even down into Nicaragua, start sending their children to this school, Uplift. In 1866, Peter is put forward by his congregation, actually a few years earlier, because he was studying for ordination, because they said, we need a full-time pastor, recognized ordained pastor. And so Bishop Kipp ordained him in 1866 as a deacon. He was always a deacon of the bishop and not of Trinity. Trinity sometimes wants to take credit for all of this, but they weren't necessarily a part of this whole movement. In fact, they charged the bishop to hold the service of ordination at Trinity. So that kind of gives you a hint of the attitude of the vestry at that point. That year, they founded the first high school for blacks west of the Mississippi. It was called the Phoenixonian Institute, the name that his parents had given to an attempted school in Connecticut that failed. And so again, the memory is being carried forward. In 1871, the 13th and 14th Amendment, giving first citizenship to blacks and therefore the right to vote, was passed by Congress. The day after it was passed in Congress, Peter and three of the black leaders, the men in that congregation, showed up at the county clerk's office and said, "We want to register to vote." The county clerk says, "You can't, you're black." And they said, "Oh, no. Yesterday, the 15th Amendment passed. Check it out." He contacted the state attorney general, and the state attorney general said, "Register them." So they were the first registered blacks. 1875, the state Supreme Court declares that all public schools will be integrated. Imagine that, California, almost 100 years ahead of the rest of the country, integrating all schools. Therefore, St. Philip's Academy, the Phoenixonian Institute, no longer was needed, and so it collapsed. Mainly because there was very little interest at Trinity or in the Diocese of California to have a black congregation. To the extent that Peter was never ordained a priest because of the racism of the clergy and the racism of the standing committee and the lack of the will of the bishops to ordain him a priest. In spite of that, he said, "My mandate does not come from the Episcopal Church or from the bishop, it comes from God. And I am called to serve the people in greatest need." So the collapse of the black ministry in San Jose would then lead to him being called to North Carolina, to New Bern, where a very prominent black congregation that even had a hospital, again, because blacks couldn't go to public hospital institutions. He became rector of St. Cyprian's in 1882, served there until 1900, and then he was called by the Bishop of Florida to come and become first the missioner to black congregations. There were three, and eventually rector of St. Cyprian, where he served until 1917. Again, in both of those states and dioceses, the first black Episcopal clergyman. Now, with that example, as we heard in the second lesson today, of a part of the great cloud of witnesses that surrounds us, we always commemorate saints, not because they just need to be remembered, but because their story may touch something in us. It may begin to stir something up. You know, a light bulb goes off, a door opens up. Wow, I begin to put together some pieces. That's what the commemoration of saints is supposed to do. Not worship as though they were a distant God, but whose story is still so alive that it has a presence in the gathered community. So this morning, as we remember Peter, we remember Annie, who was very unassuming, yet a very accomplished pianist, which tells you a lot about her family, who had the resources to have her trained as a pianist. Her father was an English doctor, and when she was conceived, the Presbyterian minister in Georgia, where he was serving, said, "Any child conceived by a white man and a black woman that child is a legal member of your family. And you are to raise that child and give that child, one, born free, but also all the benefits of a child of your as offspring. She was trained as a nurse, and she was the first professional black person of any medical profession in Santa Clara County, ministering not only to the children of the school, but also to those of color in the community that could not access medical assistance. So as you hear their story, let whatever has been triggered within you begin to percolate. Let it gestate within you to say, I want to know more about them, or I begin to make these connections. What about the black community here in Santa Cruz County? There's a book a colleague of mine wrote, published several years ago, that gives the history of the black families. More than likely, they sent some of their children over to St. Philip's. And then, of course, I love the smile on your faces when I showed you the connection between Keith Johnson and this congregation. There are direct links. So whatever started to get teased out in you, let it grow. Let it grow. After church today at coffee hour, those of you that want to do some deep diving into the history of this parish, we're going to sit with the original parish register of 1901 and look at some of those names and see if we can begin to even do a further reach back into the history of Santa Cruz County to see what are the roots of this particular